Okay, so for the rest of tonight we're going over what they then called the Great War. Up to that point, the most devastating war in Europe's history. So there's more soldier deaths and more devastation in this war than anything the Europeans had really ever experienced outside of the Roman Empire. So in their time they called it the Great War. They didn't call it World War I because they didn't know there was going to be a World War II. So when you look in textbooks and you look in journal entries and diaries, they'll often call it the Great War until the second one comes around in the 1930s. 1940s also. And the Great War is important in U.S. history because up to this point, since about 1815, the U.S. had gone isolationist in a lot of ways. The U.S. had stopped paying attention to European politics and told the Europeans that they didn't care about European politics after 1815. And that's even written to what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. That basically said Europeans can stay in the Eastern Hemisphere, stay in that part of the world, and the United States will stay in the Western part, in the Americas. So there's a pretty big foreign policy real split where the U.S. just kind of stayed in its own area and didn't really get involved in European politics very much. And the Great War is important because it brings the United States into international and specifically European politics again. And obviously the United States has really been there almost ever since. They go isolationist a bit in the 1920s and 30s again. But really since World War II, the United States has been the predominant world power and therefore has built up alliance systems where the alliances will literally say, if any one country in Europe is attacked, the United States immediately goes to war. So we'll get there eventually. That's more Cold War stuff. But the Great War is the first kind of sucking the U.S. back into this position that a lot of Americans didn't want their country to be in, and a lot of American foreign policy leaders and American politicians didn't want to be in. So the Great War is important to study in European history, obviously, but also in U.S. history, because also the United States is on the cusp of becoming the predominant economic power of the world. This is where the United States overtakes Germany and Britain as the biggest economy of any country on the planet. And the United States has been there ever since. So the Great War is important for a whole lot of different reasons in U.S. history, and obviously centrally important to European developments. So from here on out, we're going to study not just what's happening internally, domestically in the United States, but also what's happening in much of the rest of the world, because U.S. foreign policy will kind of re-emerge as an important thing in U.S. domestic politics even. So a lot of this is going to be spent with European history to give a kind of backstory to how this war got started and why it became so catastrophic, and eventually to get to the U.S. Intervention in it and what the U.S. does to affect the outcome. So this is what Europe looks like on the eve of what we today call World War I breaking out in 1914. The Europeans had built up alliance systems. And these alliance systems really start to emerge when Germany is made into an actual country. Germany was not one unified country for about 1,000 years until 1871. Germany was split down into any different point in history between about the year 850 or so, going all the way until the mid-1800s. Germany was split into 200 to 300 different little governments on the city level, the town level, the sometimes county level. There's just hundreds and hundreds of them. So you have all these different German princes and politicians that are always kind of fighting against each other. And the Germans are not unified in one country. And the Europeans largely like it that way, because they know if the Germans ever get together to have one country, they will be very powerful. They have a gigantic population. By the 1800s, when they start going into the Industrial Revolution themselves, when Germany becomes a country in 1871, they immediately have the biggest population in Europe, the biggest army outside of Russia, and you can see why. Russia is just astronomically larger, has a bigger population to draft soldiers from. But the German military will be, the army will be the biggest, the strongest, the most efficient, the most heavily industrialized. And Germany will become the world's biggest economy the day that it is created. So they overtake Britain in a whole lot of different ways, economically, militarily, foreign policy-wise. And when Germany is brought together, that immediately scares the crap out of the French. Because the French and the Germans have been fighting against each other for a long, long, long time. There's a long rivalry. So immediately when Germany becomes a country, a unified country, the French are very, very afraid of being invaded. So the French immediately start looking around the rest of Europe for anti-Germany allies. And the number one country they want is Russia in a French alliance. Because if France and Russia both go to war against Germany at the same time, Germany has a big problem, right? They have to fight invasions from both sides. They call it a two-front war. They have to fight two enemies in two different places at the same time. That becomes logistically difficult for the Germans. Yeah?
When Germany was created, or they decided to have an alliance, was that still their priority to be fighting the French?
The Germans, right from 1871, their high leadership understands that another war with France is very likely. So their best bet is to keep France isolated, stop them from signing alliances with other countries, specifically Russia, and to build up some kind of German alliance for their own defense. And that's why they sign up with Austria-Hungary, which is a very funky kind of multinational, multicultural empire. So the German high leadership understands that that's a possibility, and they very, very quickly start moving to keep France isolated, especially from Russia and also from Britain. And if you ever study European diplomacy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Germans are desperate to stop Britain from signing an alliance from France. Because the Germans believe if Britain, France, and Russia all get together, then Germany is going to be in a very bad place. So the Germans are always telling the British, we should sign an alliance between us two. We'll be the most powerful group by far in the world. Because they had the two biggest economies, the two biggest militaries, all that stuff. The British don't like it. They trust the French a little bit more. Which is a big historical turning point. Because the British and French have been fighting each other also for 1,000 years or so. Right? Since the 11th century. Since mid-1000s. Right? Like 1050s. So that's been going on for a long time. And this is a major historical turning point. Basically, the British feared the Germans more than they feared the French at that point. And really, ever since, the British and the French have been pretty close allies, foreign policy-wise. They still make fun of each other all the time, if you ever pay attention to those jokes, like in movies and whatnot. But this is the alliance system that eventually emerges. Eventually, Britain and France join up with Russia, and they're basically an anti-German alliance. The Germans are desperate. They sign up with Austria-Hungary. They try to get Italy on their side. Italy goes back and forth. Even in the middle of the war, they change sides a couple of times. So Italy is unreliable and kind of a secondary, sideshow kind of power. The Germans also sign up the Ottoman Empire down here in going into the Middle East, or what we today call the Middle East. And the problem with this alliance system is eventually so many different European countries sign up in one side or the other, one group or the other, that they become like two big armed camps. They're all building up their armies. They're all threatening each other eventually. So that if any one little attack happens between France and Germany, that will immediately bring all these other allies into a large catastrophic war. Right? So any one major political problem in Europe can explode and cause a continental war. That's what historians call these things, when all these countries get involved. And this hadn't happened for 100 years since Napoleon, by 1914. So this is a big, big threat, and a lot of Europeans know that this is a threat. The Americans are just kind of watching this from the other side of the ocean, saying, well, that's a problem. But that's what happens when you have monarchies, when you have dictatorships that are not elected by their people, right? They say the United States is better because voters will never accept U.S. trying to do this stuff. Any politician that tries to run for the presidency that wants to join up with either of these two sides is going to get voted out of office. because Americans do not want to sign up with the Europeans. And they resist it for a long, long, long time. So what we've largely grown up with, this idea of always support the Europeans, always sign an alliance with them, is very new in the American experience. And even President Washington and Jefferson gave advice to future Americans: never sign up with European alliances, because they always fight each other. You will be dragged into wars that you have no interest in. I mean, the Americans look at this and say, who cares? Who cares who wins that? We have no interest. Stay out. Okay, so that's the alliance system. A major problem breaks out. Really, to go back to the map really quick, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire are seen as two of the weakest powers in all of Europe. And throughout the late 1800s, especially Austria-Hungary is seen as a collapsing empire, the weakest. That largely because they are a multinational, multicultural empire. They speak something like 70 different languages, from German all the way down into like the Slavic types of languages, down in kind of southeastern Europe. So it is probably the biggest melting pot of different cultures and ethnicities and cultural identities of any of the major European powers. And of course, this is a time of great racism, and a lot of the other kind of foreign policy analysts said that no country that has all these different kinds of people in it will ever be unified enough to be a real fighting force. And they said the same thing about the Americans. And Hitler is very famous eventually for saying that, who cares if the United States declares war against us? They're made up of Irish and French and all kinds of these different backgrounds, and they hate each other more than they'll hate us. Miscalculation. All right. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for short, the Austrian Empire, because the Austrians are the most powerful group in this government, were seen as the weak and kind of sick, plague-infected, dying kind of government. They were inefficient. They had been beaten in other smaller wars in the 1800s, specifically by the Germans. So they were seen as, if a war breaks out, they're most likely to lose and be unable to defend themselves. And a lot of the people living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire are very much aware of this. They're aware that the other Europeans are looking at them and their land like wolves, waiting for the weak sheep to die so that they can carve up Austria and take land for themselves. So there's a lot of fear amongst the Austrians particularly, that if the next war breaks out, if they lose, their country's going to be eviscerated and broken up either into smaller countries, or Russia's going to take a huge chunk and Germany's going to take a huge chunk and all that kinds of stuff. And one of the few sources of hope and optimism for the Austrian government and its people is the heir to the throne, a guy known as the Archduke. He is kind of like the John F. Kennedy or the Obama of his government in his time. He is the symbol of hope and change and efficiency that can make this country great and powerful again the way it was in the 15 and 1600s. So they've really declined. And he publicly starts talking about, when I get to the throne, when I become the actual emperor, I will rebuild this place. I know what to do. And we will become powerful again. And people ask him, what is your plan for returning our country to their glorious past? And he says he wants to unite a lot of the Slavic groups into one large state in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, and then bring that one kind of Slavic super-state into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He thinks that is one of the sources of the solution. Just as Hungary had been brought in, had been an independent country for a while, and had been kind of submerged into what became known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's his plan. A lot of the people living in the areas that he's pointing at on the map and saying we want to gain that chunk don't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because the Hungarians are largely a kind of minority partner. They're not the ones making decisions. And the Hungarians had gone into revolt against Austria to try to stop that and had lost. So a lot of these Slavic peoples do not want to be part of the Austrian-dominated empire. They want their own nations. They want their own countries. They want to be independent. So you have a budding conflict between a lot of peoples living in those areas and what this guy wants to do. And a lot of these groups decide to eventually either try to convince him to not pursue this policy, or if you can't convince him, to remove him from the equation. And they eventually do that in June of 1914. When he goes to, I believe it's Serbia, to visit those people and give a speech to try to kind of rally support for his idea. As he is traveling, they assassinate him. There is a murder plot against him, and they do get him. And if you've ever read the details or seen a documentary of that assassination plot, I mean, it's Bugs Bunny kind of ridiculous. They fail in like the first 4 stages of it, and then they happen to kill him because his driver took a bad turn and just happened to park right in front of one of the assassins. And the whole thing was an abysmal failure. They threw bombs at his car and all kinds of stuff. Nothing worked. And then they just happened to pull onto a bridge, and one of the assassins said, "Oh, look, there they are," and started shooting at him and got him that way. So it was a bungled attempt overall, but in the end they do accomplish their goal. They take him out. The Austrian people are not happy about this, because their source of optimism is now dead. And this isn't a guy who has died of a heart attack. He was shot multiple times. So it's pretty obvious what's happened here. And the Austrian people start demanding justice. So Serbia's down here. The Austrian government, located at Vienna, says this is a terrorist attack in a foreign country. We demand that the Serbian government investigate this and, bring to trial the people that are responsible. It's pretty obviously a domestic terrorist type of group in Serbia that has done this. So the government in Vienna, the Austrian government, is telling the Serb government, you have to do something about this. Serbian government drags its feet. And there's accusations that their secret police, kind of their CIA and FBI of their government, knew that this was going to happen and allowed it to happen. And when those ideas start getting published in European newspapers, the Austrian government says, we no longer trust the Serbs to run this investigation. We want to send our own investigators from Austria into this foreign country to do the investigating. And what do you think the Serbs thought about that? Screw you, this happened in our country, we'll run the investigation. Does this stuff still happen today anywhere? Absolutely. When there is a bombing of U.S. government or U.S. private company property in Saudi Arabia, who investigates? The FBI. The American FBI. Because a lot of times the American government does not trust other governments to run a good or objective, powerful investigation. The Americans do it themselves. And the same thing's happening right now in Libya, right? Are they relying on the Libyan government to do the investigation? No, they're sending in the FBI. So the Serb government says, no, we're not going to accept that. The Austrian government says, you will either accept our investigation and allow it to proceed, or we will take our army, invade you, conquer your country, and then run the investigation. So you have a choice. You can either allow us to do it, or you can force us to conquer your land, and then we'll do it. The problem is that Serbia has a contract, an alliance with Russia, as a lot of these other places like Greece, Romania, and stuff. They very much feared at some point being invaded by Austria. So they signed a defensive treaty with Russia, where Russia promised, if Austria ever invades a place like Serbia, Russia will attack Austria. And what does that mean? When Russia attacks Austria, Germany has a decision to make. Will they uphold their treaty with Austria and defend Austria by attacking Russia? And then the French have a decision to make. Now that the Germans have attacked their ally Russia, will the French declare war on Germany? And in this line, This is what historians call the August days. It is the dominoes falling one after another, step by step. And in just about a week or so, virtually all of these governments in Europe decide to go to war against each other. And it is literally, I'm going to war against you. What are you going to do? And they start pointing fingers at each other. And you have this insane amount of messages that circulates amongst all the European capitals. And eventually war is decided. Probably the biggest step is that Germany's military strategy is to win this two-front war against France and Russia in a very specific way. Basically, they thought that Russia was going to be slow to get its army together and attack. So Germany's plan, its military strategy, is to hit France hard, take out Paris, and knock them out of the war before Russia can even get going. So therefore, Germany honestly won't even really wait around for France to declare war. They're going to start moving to attack. And that's what, in the end, sucks all the countries in. So theoretically, you could have had a war that only involved the East without the Western countries getting involved. But this is the kind of major fault line that gets hit. So in these so-called August days of late July and early August 1914, one by one the European capital cities start going to war against each other. And the alliances kick in. That's where the dominoes fall. There was a very popular idea in Europe at the time that this was going to be a short war, for several different ideas, or several different reasons. Probably number one amongst them is that the Europeans had not fought a long, bloody type of conflict for about 100 years. So all the people who had fought the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, they're all gone, right? Virtually. Just like all the people who fought World War I 100 years ago. They're all gone. They're not around to make decisions anymore or give us advice. And oftentimes when you get the people who participated in the last catastrophe, when they are gone, the new foreign policy leaders can often make those same mistakes over again. Because they don't have direct personal experience with that kind of social and economic pain that these wars bring. And that's another kind of scary thing to contemplate when you realize that the major population that fought World War II is now largely disappearing, right? Just through old age. They're dying off. So, number one, there hadn't been a long war in about a century. Number two, the other smaller scale European wars that have been fought in the rest of the 1800s were all very short wars. I mean, some of them only lasted 10 days. Because they built up their industrial infrastructure. They moved troops around faster with trains rather than just walking or riding horses from one battle to another. They were able to hit harder because they had heavier cannon, and they moved faster. And in the 1800s, the idea developed that whichever army moves the fastest is able to use their railway lines most efficiently in moving soldiers, usually win the war. So there's this idea that the war is kind of a race. Whoever moves fastest wins. And if you have all these countries that are obsessed with moving the fastest, then they're all going to move real fast and hit each other real hard, and probably the war won't last very long. Right? And the idea of this frenzied race becomes a very heavily popular idea. The race to the sea or the race to Paris or something like that. It's advertised in newspapers. So they call the wars of the 1800s the wars of the train schedules. Whoever can figure out the most efficient way usually won. And generally there's an idea that the European economies, the powerful ones, are industrialized by this point. They mostly run with the factory system now and machines. And those factories become targets in this war. Because if you want to win the war, you want to destroy your enemy's ability to make guns and bombs and boots and uniforms and all that stuff. That's what will force them to stop, to give up. So if your center of your economy is a direct target, a military target, that could destroy your economy very quickly. And a lot of economists argued in the the fall of 1914, this war probably will not last very long because no logical government is going to risk the full-on destruction of their economy just to win this type of, short-term battle. So they say, this war just economically probably will not last very much longer than a few months. So eventually you get this idea that the war will be over by Christmas, by the end of the year. And it's also a great advertising slogan. For who? Who uses this to advertise to the population?
Army recruiters.
Army recruiters. If you want to join the war, you're not going to be in there for years and years and years. You're going to go in there, you're going to get training for a few weeks, go off and fight a few battles, and you'll be back home. If. And they literally had posters that they advertised in newspapers and magazines, all kinds of stuff, that had the image of this older guy, this old kind of white-haired kind of guy with young children, and kind of telling them a story. And the idea is, this older guy is, you as a young person grown up decades in the future. And the idea behind these advertisements are, what kind of story are you going to tell your grandchildren about what you did during the war? Are you going to tell them an exciting story about how I joined the army and went off and had these battles and these great adventures and did all this stuff and we won the war because of my determination and I helped out? Or are you going to tell them, I sat at home and watched it on movie clips or read about it in newspapers? So there's a real kind of emotional pull with the idea that this isn't going to get bloody because you're probably going to survive. And you're not going to be in there for year after year after year. It's going to be more kind of adventure than anything else, which is another thing that you often get when the last generation that fought the last catastrophic war goes away, and now you get these kind of new younger guys who are all gung-ho for the tragedy. The people who volunteer for this stuff are usually the first ones killed, right? That's true in all big wars. The ones who volunteer in the beginning don't usually survive. And overwhelmingly, the guys who volunteered in the first few months of the war did not live longer. Did not usually live to see even the next couple of years. This turns into a slaughter. All right, so questions about any of this stuff so far? No? Okay, some military strategy. Again, the Germans' idea in winning the war is to hit France hard. The French had built up a huge amount of defense on their border with Germany, called the Maginot Line. It's a French term. It's spelled Maginot, Maginot. They built this thing up in the 1800s even. They started building in the 1800s because they realized that a war with Germany is pretty likely at some point. So they built up their border impenetrable defenses, basically. They built supply lines. They dug this thing into the ground. They put, cannons in it. They did all kinds of supply line stuff in order to guarantee that the Germans could never invade into France. And the German military strategy to defeat this Maginot Line is to send maybe a decoy force against it and get the French all excited because this thing's finally going to get useful, and then do basically an end around. Go around through neutral Belgium, because the Belgian army is almost non-existent compared to the Germans, and go around the Maginot Line and hit it from the side and from behind. Because the French apparently were not smart enough to build their cannons on turrets that could turn to the left and shoot at the enemy if they went around the other way. This becomes known as the Schlieffen Plan. Obvious German word, SCH, right? So this is the German military plan. They devised several different prongs of this invasion to go through Belgium. The first couple prongs, they're immediately responsible. The first three prongs are just getting behind the line and attacking it from behind to destroy it as much as possible. The other two prongs, the western prongs, are meant to go all the way around Paris and get to the western part of Paris and surround it and take out the French capital. And they figure if they do that, they'll knock the French out of the war, hopefully within a few weeks. And once they do that, they can go off and fight the Russians in the east, and that's their plan for winning the war. So France and Germany go to war. The Germans use this plan, and it's very successful. They invade through Belgium, which was a neutral country, hadn't declared war, and that convinces Britain to declare war because Britain was trying to stay out, and therefore it's a kind of insult against neutrality. The problem with the invasion is that the German high leadership panicked in the Schlieffen Plan because the Russians looked like they were moving faster than anticipated. So they took some of the soldiers from these western two prongs and left them in eastern Germany to face the Russian invasion. Does that make sense? So these western two prongs are weakened because they don't have the planned amount of troops. And that really does Germany in. And when this invasion eventually goes, they get all the way really to the doorstep of Paris. Let's see. September 1914, the farthest German advance is this green line. Paris is here. The Germans get to about here, about 20 miles or so east of Paris, and they get stuck. The French bring up a huge amount of army reserves and surround Paris in a desperate attempt to stop the German invasion. So that's as far as the Germans get in fall of 1914. There's a gigantic battle here called the Battle of the Marne that the French win, and the Germans have to start to retreat a little bit, and they start digging trenches to hold the territory that they've conquered. So this is where you see the trenches being dug, this kind of dotted pinkish kind of line. And the Germans will sit in northeastern France and Belgium. Every once in a while they'll try to attack, and this becomes known as the Western Front. This largely unmovable line where both sides dig trenches, and the defensive tactics of the war are more powerful. Therefore, they'll keep launching attacks against each other for year after year after year, and they are almost completely unsuccessful. And hundreds of thousands of soldiers will die in these attacks to gain maybe 2 or 3 miles of territory. This becomes literally a slaughter. And that becomes known as the Western Front, and it is largely unmoving for about 3.5 years. And that becomes the kind of dominant vision of what we have for much of the Great War, the idea of trench warfare.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what the Western Front was again?
Yeah, it's this line of trenches in northeastern France and Belgium that the attacks don't really move the defenses very much. The attacks are mostly unsuccessful. And they will literally launch, 400,000 troops against the enemy. And it just won't be, it won't push the enemy out of their own trenches. The defensive tactics are far superior at this point in military history. So the Germans get stuck over there. They have not taken Paris. They have not knocked the French out. And now the British are starting to arrive. So, other questions about this at all?
Didn't a good amount of soldiers die just from being in the French for so long?
Yep. Especially in a major flu outbreak hits in, I believe, somewhere around 1916, 1917. Kills a couple million. Just because they're in very squalid conditions. I mean, this is literally digging a trench that's 5 or 6 feet high. That is not usually reinforced. So you're living in the mud. And there's rats in there. And, all the kinds of rodents and all that stuff that spreads the flu. And obviously you're packed in with a whole bunch of other people because you're soldiers in defense. You're packed together pretty closely. And the flu spreads like wildfire. Other questions? Nope. Okay, moving on. In the east, the Russians start mobilizing their army. The problem with the Russian army, they have by far the most troops in Europe, but they have not industrialized yet. They don't have the factories to churn out the guns and the bullets and the uniforms and all that. So their armies are usually large, but very badly supplied and usually pretty badly trained. So they have numbers, but not usually as many guns as often the Germans will. So their problem is always material, getting enough material to continue fighting. So the Russian army is large, but not as powerful. They invade Eastern Germany, an area in Eastern Germany known as East Prussia. They launch their invasion into Germany and get kicked out pretty quickly. The German army is far, far more powerful as a fighting force. Then they try to invade the Balkans to do something about the Austro-Hungarian invasion in those areas. They gain some territory, but again are fairly quickly kicked out, even by the kind of German army that's in that area, but largely the Austrians, and the Austrians aren't even that much of a fighting force. So the Russian army is pretty largely humiliated in these two attacks. And then the Germans and their allies in the Balkans start counterattacking into Russian territory and start making gains into Russia pretty quickly. And millions of Russian soldiers die in this. So we skip past going into the end of 1916. So about 2 solid years of Russian military failures. I mean, just complete abysmal failures. And many, many Russian young men have died in this. And the Russian population gets outraged against their own government. And they will go into revolution in the spring of 1917. For a lot of kind of inequalities, domestic problems within Russia itself, specifically economic. And it appears that the Russian failures in the war were just the very last straw for the Russian people. And they rise up and take out their government within about a week. So that will take the Russians largely out of the war in the long term. And we'll talk about the Russian Revolution. I think it's next week. So questions about any of those? Nope. And obviously we are skipping past a lot of the details of battles and whatnot. But I think it's far more important to get to understand why these militaries cannot really successfully attack each other anymore. Number one, just like militaries today, most military leaders are guys who have been in the military for decades and have gone through the officer training schools. That's what they largely do for college. They go through the tactical schools in the United States, places like West Point, to study military tactics and how to win wars. So these guys were, by 1914, 1915, they had been in the army since 1870s, 1880s. They've been in a long time, and they were schooled in the 1800s about how to win wars, and they learned Napoleon's tactics because he was seen as the great military genius for at least the past few hundred years. So they studied his tactics in detail. They tried to learn the new industrial technologies like railway lines and how to use those in warfare and whatnot. But the technological advancements in war really go far, far beyond anything they had ever learned when they were in college. And they show an inability to adapt. The military leaders of Britain, France, and also Germany will fight the Great War with 1800s ideas. And they prove themselves pretty incapable of creative thought. How can they use the new technologies to theorize a new idea for offensive, attacking warfare? And the real tragedy of the Great War is that they launched the exact same kinds of infantry assaults that Napoleon won with 100 years ago. That will be catastrophic in this war. Mass infantry assault means you get your soldiers together, you give them all a gun, and you charge at the enemy. And that can work when the enemy also only has a rifle that they have to reload by shoving something down the muzzle, and take 30 or 45 seconds to reload their gun and shoot at you again, right? Because in those 30 seconds you can run at them and get to them and hit them in the head to take them out, or do whatever you're going to do to knock out the defensive ability. This becomes catastrophic because by 1914 they have created machine guns that automatically reload. And instead of shooting one round every 45 seconds or every minute or something, they can shoot 30 or 40 rounds. So you getting up and running at the enemy is not effective, to put it lightly. And it turns into a mass slaughter. And this is why in some of these battles, the British and French, when they attack, will lose 60,000 soldiers in one day. That's the whole U.S. experience in Vietnam. All the soldiers lost from the U.S. military in Vietnam in one day. So this becomes, these guys become humiliated by this. And a lot of the kind of counterculture people of this time, government critics, start, putting up, taking spray cans and whatnot, and drawing these guys' picture all over London with the catchphrase, "Never trust Haig." And of course, they're the anti-government radicals of the time. But these guys are very largely humiliated in this war for that major reason. This is what trench warfare looks like on a daily basis, especially on the Western Front. They literally dug trenches into the ground, and you spent your time at ground level. Because the enemy has snipers all the time hiding in their trenches, looking for any movement on your side that could indicate an attack. So if you stick your head up for a little bit too long, there's a sniper constantly looking in your area. You stick your hand up, you could get shot off. You stick your head up, you could get shot off. So people literally stayed underneath the barricade as much as possible. Because any exposed life, the snipers got so bored because no one sticks their head up, that they start shooting down birds and rats and anything they see moving around. So the secret of World War I is basic trench warfare. When the enemy starts charging at you, you get to your machine guns and just mow them down. That causes a secondary problem. How do you destroy the enemy's trenches and destroy their machine guns before you attack? That becomes a kind of big goal. They eventually bring in giant cannon to bombard the enemy areas with exploding shells, with bombs, to kill off their soldiers and destroy their machine guns. And theoretically, once you've done that, it should be a pretty easy invasion, right? An easy attack. The problem is that very quickly they understood that if you just dig a little bit further into the ground, the shell will explode above you and you'll most likely survive underground. So when the bombardment starts against you and you're the defending army, you go and hide in the bunkers. And sometimes you'll stay there for 3 days while the bombs fall all around you. Which has a pretty deep psychological impact, right? Because any second can be your last. And have you ever heard the term, "you never hear the one that gets you"? That comes out of this war because these shells made screaming sounds as they got closer. That you still hear in like Bugs Bunny cartoons and whatnot, right? And the reason they say you never hear the one that gets you is to calm down in the bunker. If you don't hear the one that's going to kill you, then you don't have to worry about all the ones you do hear, right? So it's supposed to be a psychological relief. But if you're in there for 3 days and any second can be your last, people are obviously worried, and you get a lot of psychological damage that you can see on this guy's face on the right. And this is where you start getting the term being used called shell shock. These soldiers were psychologically destroyed very often. They joined the army thinking this thing was going to be a great adventure, and their experience with war destroyed them. Even if they survived the war, they have an inability to re-enter society. And back then they called it shell shock. What do they call it today? Post-traumatic stress disorder, which one of my favorite comedians says is just a way of taking the humanity out. Give you a rigid scientific term that takes all the kind of emotional pain out of it. And that's what governments often do. Because they realize that when you say shell shock, people have sympathy for the people fighting in this stuff, and they want to end the war. If you get the right to vote, you will vote against politicians who want to continue in a system that creates shell shock for your own citizens. Right? That's where they start coming up with battle fatigue and post-traumatic stress. It just takes all of the emotional context out of it. And it's a government strategy. And now they don't even call it that. They just break it down to the letters, right? The acronym. PTSD. Sounds like a drug. So there's a lot of very famous depictions of what it's like to be in the bunker. and what it's like to be a soldier and try to go back to your hometown after you've been in this war for a few weeks or a few months or whatever. You go back, and a lot of the population is still want to fight the war, and they say, oh, we support our troops, we support our troops, and the troops come back and say, you don't know anything about our experience. Right? And you still have a lot of troops saying very similar things today. The problems of this trench warfare are almost overwhelmingly the fact that the industrial warfare was very effective in creating defensive weapons. The machine gun, they lined their trenches with barbed wire, so even if by chance you are invading, you are attacking, you're running at the enemy, somehow by luck you don't get mowed down by a machine gun, you now have to climb through razor wire and hope to not get cut to shreds, which obviously slows you down and gives your enemy that much more time to shoot at you. So barbed wire, again, industrial product, something made in factories. Supply lines, they have miles and miles of supply lines to always make sure that their troops on the front lines have enough bullets, enough barbed wire, enough cannon shells, enough of the kind of supplies of war that these armies rely on. You first also start getting the use of electronic communications in war. At first, the telegraph is the kind of big one because you can set up telegraph lines fairly quickly and cheaply. Telephone lines will come up eventually later. But those are sources of attack also, right? Because you don't want your enemy communicating with its friends. So when they start trying to put up telegraph lines, they very quickly get shot down or bombed or something like that. So eventually they even start relying on messenger pigeons, which are hard to shoot down. But snipers eventually get a lot of those too. A lot of the man-made fortifications, particularly the trenches themselves, were oftentimes, especially the Germans, got really good at reinforcing their trenches. So their trenches were generally cleaner. They often put kind of wood flooring and wood walls to hold the earth up so they didn't have to have direct contact with the mud all the time. It seems that the British and French either didn't have the money or the will or the idea to do that. But it's well known that the German trenches were much nicer to live in than the Westerners. And because you have these two trenches, sometimes literally only a few hundred feet apart from each other, and you have snipers on both sides, anything that moves out there in that middle ground gets killed, and killed quickly. So that becomes known as no man's land. If you try to go walking out there, you're going to get shot really fast. So there's a lot of horrible stories of when an attack happens and it fails, you have a whole lot of wounded soldiers out there in no man's land, right? People have been hit by machine gun fire or something, and no one's willing to go rescue them. Because no one's going to stick their head up over the trench and try to drag their friend back into safety, because they're going to get shot too. So you have all these horrible stories of after an attack attempt, a lot of soldiers just out there in the middle of the night screaming because they've been hit and they know they have no way back. And again, you have this ridiculous and insane focus on mass infantry assaults against fortified positions, which does not work anymore because of the increased firepower, especially the machine gun. So, questions about any of these at all? All right. And you have the general ineffectiveness of industrial offensive weapons. They built gigantic cannons, and I'll show you a video in a little bit that depicts what it was like to be next to those cannons, and they're just massive. Cannons that are half the size of this room that took many men to operate. They thought that bombarding the enemy trenches would be a good idea to kind of soften them up, kill as many of the enemy as you can before you attack. That is countered by the digging of bunkers, reinforced bunkers often also. You also got the invention, the first human flights, like the Wright brothers' flights in 1906. So it's a few years after that. So they have fairly high flying planes by this point. But they're mostly used for reconnaissance, which means they put cameras on them, they took pictures of the enemy movements and whatnot, tried to guess where the enemies were strongest. They're not really using these for attack yet. Every once in a while you get a bunch of planes that fight each other. They'll put machine guns on top of a plane and shoot at each other. But these are not the giant bombers that we have today. So they're not really useful as offensive weapons at this point in history. They will be by World War II. They do invent tanks, and I believe it's the British that invent the first tanks. The general idea is if you have problems running at the enemy and getting hit by machine gun fire, build up an armored personnel carrier that can resist machine gun fire and send that thing out. So if you build up a whole bunch of those, you can move your troops, crash them into the enemy trench, and then you can get out and fight and possibly destroy the enemy. One major problem is that the engines for these tanks, they're lined with steel to resist the machine guns. The engines at first are not very powerful, so they're too heavy and they go out and they get stuck in the mud, and they try to put just average kind of rubber wheels on them. That doesn't work because they're sink down in the mud. So they eventually put steel tracks on them. That helps, but that just makes them that much more heavy. They eventually even start putting cannons on top of them, so they become literally attack weapons themselves. But a lot of times they literally get stuck out there. And if you're a bunch of troops that get stuck in a tank out in the middle of no man's land, you have two options. Get out and run, which may not work because you'll probably get shot in the back. Or sit in a tank and hope maybe the attack is successful. And if it's not, you'll probably starve to death. Or maybe a third option is to shoot yourself inside the tank, but no one who's staying in the tank wants that, right? You don't want the guy who's sitting in a room the size of this to shoot himself, because then you got to deal with the mess. So the tanks had big problems. Another big problem for the British is that they weren't smart enough, apparently, to be quiet about the tanks and make like 5,000 of them and all use them at the same time in one surprise kind of attack. They made like 12 and sent them out to the field, which let the Germans know what this thing is, and so they could start building their own and counter-attack with tanks also. So tanks aren't all that useful. They also invent poison gas, what we today think of as mustard gas. Often stuff that if you inhale it will basically set your lungs on fire and burn you from the inside out and kill you that way. Horrible way to die. Poison gas is unpredictable because they're not yet putting it in bombs and launching it at the enemy. They largely have it in their own trenches, and when the wind is blowing at the enemy, they let the gas go. So the wind takes the gas and blows it. But what's the downside of that? Yeah, sometimes the wind changes directions. And sometimes they literally let the gas go, and it starts going, and then the wind changes, starts blowing the crap right back at them. So that wasn't very helpful. And eventually, very quickly, also start developing gas masks to filter out the poison air and hopefully be able to breathe in good air, and so the soldiers could survive. So all the offensive weapons are literally a failure and ineffective in this war. So defensive strategies are most effective, and therefore you get the trench warfare. And you get a lot of insane and ridiculous attacks. Because the basic kind of attacks don't work in trench warfare, they start coming up with all kinds of just Looney Tunes ideas to win the war. The British figure eventually that if they attack way over here, down here by Turkey, if they knock the Ottomans out, and then they can knock the Austro-Hungarians out, they can isolate Germany and win the war over a few years. They launched that attack at Gallipoli. That one becomes a gigantic failure, and the British remember that for a long time. Another somewhat ridiculous one is over in Belgium. Apparently, I think it's the French get the idea that if you just dig tunnels underneath the enemy trenches, like Bugs Bunny style, and then do what? Pack the tunnel with dynamite and then run all the way back to your trench and light the thing, that you'll get explosions under the enemy trench that will kill all them and destroy their trenches, and then you can invade nice and easily. So in one of these invasions, before the invasion started, they dug 3 kind of trenches, 3 tunnels underneath the German trenches, packed them with dynamite and set them off. One of them went off immediately, but didn't do all that much damage. The other 2 are iffy. One of them finally exploded in something like 1964. The third one has not exploded yet. So these things are literally kind of Bugs Bunny-ish kinds of attempts to get some kind of advantage because their strategy for winning the war at first didn't work. And northeastern France and Belgium become bloodbaths, to the point where eventually they drop so many bombs and so many bullets into the soil that they can't even farm the ground there for quite a long time, many years. There's so many helmets and so many human remains that it poisons the soil for a while. And one German soldier eventually writes a book about his experience, and he calls it The Storm of Steel. It's literally just industrial hardware just falling on people eventually, falling on soldiers to kill them. Probably one of the more ridiculous ones, probably one of the biggest attacks also, the biggest offensive, is the French and British offensive at the Battle of the Somme, which is a river in kind of eastern France, kind of riverbed type of area. And you see this battle goes on for quite a long time. This is a gigantic invasion. Hundreds of thousands of troops all attack at the same time. And it fails. They fight it out for a good 5 months or so. And it doesn't work. They brought in millions of troops to support this invasion. They brought in all the guns, all the cannons they could possibly get their hands on and put it all in this one area. And it still didn't work. And the Battle of the Somme is a very famous thing. This is the one where on the first day like 60,000 are killed. The first morning even. So this becomes a mass slaughter. And I have a video to depict some stuff from the Battle of the Somme. This is also where you're getting the earliest kinds of forms of movie production cameras. And they took these to the front and made video of a lot of this stuff. And we have much of it today. And that's a common experience for soldiers. So millions upon millions are killed in this war, just absolutely slaughtered. And that was a very common experience. And the European population was horrified by this stuff. Parts of that video were shown in Britain, in London, in movie theaters. Because moviegoers and the general public wanted to know what their husbands and their brothers and their sons were experiencing. And when they show this stuff in movie theaters, people are crying and they demand that their government stop the war. So they stopped showing it in movie theaters really fast. They pulled it. It was too controversial. People couldn't deal with really seeing this stuff up close. Okay, now we get into the U.S. experience. The United States and the American population in general did not want to take part in this war. They hated it. The general American perspective when this war breaks out is this is a war of kings. Who cares which one wins? The Americans hate kings. They hate monarchies. And the United States declares neutrality immediately. But over a couple years or so, eventually a kind of anti-German sentiment starts to rise in the country. In a lot of different ways. Number one, because Germany went through Belgium, which was a neutral country. And just like Britain, a lot of Americans start saying, well, if we're neutral also, Germany attacking Belgium is a slap in the face to neutrality. Therefore, we might want to think about getting involved. Another way is there are, a lot of cultural connections to Britain. we're speaking English. That's one. There are a lot of ideas that go back and forth between Britain, artistic, cultural kinds of things. So there are more cultural connections to Britain than Germany particularly. And they remember, a lot of Americans start saying that we should help the French. The American government should help the French government in this war because the French government helped the United States, the American revolutionaries, during the Revolutionary War against Britain. The French intervened. So the president at the time, Wilson, who largely got elected because the Republicans split in the vote of 1912, and who had mostly campaigned on a domestic platform, his so-called New Freedom, right, his progressive era kinds of ideas, is now faced with a foreign policy crisis. His government immediately declares neutrality because they realized that was in their best interest. There's no point in risking American lives to go win a European war for a king. You know, why? He starts coming under intense pressure to bring the United States into the war. And when he runs for re-election in 1916, his number one campaign promise is to stay out of the war. And he realizes he's not going to get re-elected if he doesn't promise that. So you have much the opposite of today, where you have candidates demanding that they will keep the United States at peace if they're elected. Where, you know, today we have candidates demanding that we will go to war if I'm elected. Okay. And they use that as an actual campaign strategy somehow to win. Another major problem facing the United States is that particularly Britain and Germany, as you get into, especially into 1915, 1916, as they realize this war is not going to end quickly, they try to start strangling each other economically. Britain sets up a blockade, which means a defensive perimeter around German ports to keep goods from entering Germany. And Germany only really has one system of ports up in their northern coastline. They only have one coastline. So they do this to stop imports. Imports of military goods or food or anything else that can be used for fighting a war. And that's an act of war that is pretty common in just military strategy. Strangle the enemy's economy and they'll give up. The British have the biggest navy in the world by far at this point. So when they send out the British Navy into the North Sea to stop other countries from getting stuff into Germany, their boats are on the surface, they're easy to see, and it's obvious that they are very powerful in stopping it. The Germans retaliate. The Germans don't have a gigantic fleet the way the British do, but they have a lot of submarines. The Germans are the first really to launch into submarine production. So they try to blockade the British islands with submarines, which is seen as an underhanded, sneaky kind of way attacking the enemy. So they're going to try to stop especially imports from the United States from reaching the British islands through submarine attack. The United States foreign policy is called commercial neutrality. The United States says our companies have the right to sell goods to any country fighting or not fighting in the war. We are not going to take sides. Our companies will sell anything they want to whoever they want. That's why they call it commerce, business neutrality. They're not taking sides. The problem for this idea is that the British blockade of Germany is effective, very effective, and the German blockade of Britain is much less effective. So by default, American companies start selling a lot more stuff to Britain and France because their goods can get through the German blockade. The British and French over time run out of money. So what do you do when you don't have cash and you need to buy something? You break out the credit card, and that's what the British and French did. So they're going in debt to American businesses. And American businesses at that point have a vested interest in who wins this war, right? They want the British and French to survive this war because they want their money at some point. It would be just like If you walk out into the parking lot and you see, say, two guys fighting out in the parking lot, if you don't know any of them, who gives a damn? As long as I don't get shot. Right? Let them beat each other to a bloody pulp. I don't care. I have no interest in who wins that fight. But then as you're walking toward your car, you look over and you say, oh, wait a minute, that guy owes me $1,000. Who do you want to win at that point? The guy that owes you money. Because if he gets put in the hospital or gets killed, you're never going to get your cash. And that's what the American businesses say about this. If the British or French lose this war, we're never going to get that payment. So American businesses in the electoral system that is driven by money, they start investing in politics and swaying politicians in office to push them toward an alliance with Britain and France to guarantee that they win the war. And at that point, Wilson starts coming under massive political pressure to bring the U.S. into the war. Even in 1916, when he is openly campaigning on the idea that the United States will stay out. He is getting massive, massive pressure. And on that campaign promise to stay out of the war, he is reelected largely in 1916, November of 16. So he will remain president. And he will backtrack immediately. The Germans realized in 1916 that the submarine warfare is pissing off the Americans, so they slow it down. They start giving warnings, and eventually they'll just stop attacking in a lot of ways altogether. In 1917, they're desperate to try to do something to win the war. So the German Navy announces internationally that they will, quote, restart unrestricted submarine warfare, which means attack any boat going toward Britain, often without warning. And Wilson uses this as the excuse to go to war against Germany. He says that this is an act of war against the United States. Had already been going on and he stayed out, but now he has the pressure behind him. So he requests a declaration of war just a few days after he is re-inaugurated for his second term in March of 1917. And the U.S. Congress declares war against Germany and its allies. The problem, though, is that the United States Army is absolutely tiny. The United States Army was smaller than the British part of the army that invaded the Battle of the Somme. So it's going to take a massive kind of military buildup in the United States to get enough troops, to train them, to get them the provisions, and to actually get them to Europe to start fighting. So they won't start arriving in very large numbers until about the spring of 1918. So it takes about a year for the U.S. war machine to, crank up. And for U.S. soldiers to start arriving in very large numbers, in the millions. It doesn't take until early the next year. Does that make sense? Leads to another great question. Why did the Americans accept this? They just re-elected this guy on the promise to stay out, and really 2 months later he's getting in. Why would the American people accept this? And one of the great explanations for this is the advertising industry. Came up with ways to emotionally convince the American people to accept this stuff. And fortunately for us, I have another video to show you on advertising in the war. Obviously, a lot of stuff that we have today with defining the kind of national enemy as, the devil incarnate, or you still have these stories about like enemy, whoever the enemy is at whatever point in U.S. history, are literally going out and killing babies just because they think it's fun. I mean, you get this repeatedly in U.S. foreign policy. What in the heck is going on here? Nothing. Okay. Okay, now we're catching. All right. So going into 1918, the Germans have now a major decision to make. They have knocked the Russians out. The Russians have gone into revolution and have declared an end to their war by the end of 1917, going into 1918. They've signed a treaty with Germany. Russia is out. And the German high leadership has a decision to make. Number one, do they end the war also in the West? Keep control of the areas they've conquered in Eastern Europe and land they've conquered from Russia and are taking in that treaty. Consolidate all those lands, those large populations, economic resources, and build like a German superstate, even more powerful than what Germany was going into the war. And then, maybe a few decades later, go back to war against France and just, really kick the crap out of France and win. Take a long-term strategy. Or do they take their troops, the German troops out of the East who have been fighting the Russians, and send them against France in a last-ditch effort to take Paris? That is the major policy dilemma facing the German high command, including the German king, the Kaiser, who is right there in the center. They eventually choose to do the second one. They will take their troops out of the Eastern Front and send them against France and Britain, hoping to knock out Paris and end the war against France before the Americans start to arrive. So they launch a gigantic attack against Paris in the spring of 1918. And they get very, very close. Where's the German advance? Now you have a brownish line that gets, again, within about 20 miles or so, 20, 30 miles of Paris, and they're stopped in almost the exact same place that they were stopped in 1914 at what becomes known as the Second Battle of the Marne. And at that point, the Germans had sent all the reserve troops they had, and they've been defeated. Now the French and British are starting to counterattack and drive the Germans back toward Belgium. And right at this point, the Americans start arriving with over 1 million fresh troops. So now the Germans appear outnumbered. And the Germans ask for peace in the fall of 1918 to avoid the overall invasion of Western Germany. Because the Americans seem to have unlimited resources in this war. So a ceasefire is declared November 11th. And they start negotiating a peace treaty. The peace treaty is extraordinarily complex because you have all these different countries fighting and they're all going to have a seat at the negotiating table. And just like with any committee, it can function fairly well when you have 4 or 5 people negotiating. They can come to an agreement fairly fast. When you got 40, it's very difficult and long and arduous. So the peace negotiations bleed into 1919. Does that make sense? Moving on from here. So questions about any of the fighting at all? All right. Because the United States is, at this point, the kind of country that is tipping the balance in favor of Britain and France in this war, President Wilson has a strong negotiating position. And he personally goes to Paris with his kind of foreign policy leaders to, in his mind, be the determining force of what this treaty is going to look like. Because if he doesn't get what he wants, he can always pull the American troops out and go home and let Britain and France try to beat Germany, which is iffy for them. So he has a very powerful position in these negotiations. He comes up, and his leaders come up with a list of 14 different ideas that they want in the peace treaty that eventually become the 14 points in the treaty. 3 of the most important are national self-determination, which means they will redraw the map of Europe. They will get rid of the German monarchy. They will get rid of Austria-Hungary almost completely. They will break it up into smaller countries that are nationalistic, which means they are countries that are drawn with borders around certain kind of nationalities and cultures. They will give a lot of independent peoples their own country, and they will make them into democratic governments. These will not be monarchies. These are going to be governments that will have ethnic majorities to keep the government kind of unified, and they will have representative politics. You will vote for your leaders. They will have presidents and congresses and parliaments. Number 2, he wants to reject absolutism, which is the idea of monarchy. All government authority resides in the person of the king, that position. So they're getting rid of kings, so they're getting rid of absolutism. He wants to get rid of militarism, the idea that you're supposed to build up your army in self-defense. He said that the buildup of these armies before the war caused the war. When you build up big armies, your military leaders will want to use them. They view them as toys to experiment with. And he wants to make foreign trade the cornerstone of international politics. Which, of course, because the United States has the biggest economy, the biggest businesses, the biggest industrial base, he is looking to remake the world in favor of the United States business class. So he calls this open trade. All borders should be open to any business going anywhere and selling and buying things internationally. And the third thing he wanted, the third major thing, was the creation of what he called the League of Nations, which is basically like an international courtroom where if two countries have a beef against each other, instead of going to war and fighting it out, they sue each other in court, and the international community is the jury that will decide which country's at fault and what the settlement's going to be. So this is literally a kind of international courtroom to settle political disputes between nations, between governments, instead of fighting it out in wars. And he said if all this goes into effect, the Great War was horrible, but he says it was the war to end all wars. This is the great lesson, and they are building up systems to avoid war in the future. And he calls this the battle for democracy, the battle for freedom, for peace. And he says that this war is the victory of peace and democracy in the world. All the death and destruction will be now put in the past, and in the 1920s, the League of Nations and other groups will formally make it illegal to go to war. Anyone who starts a war is a criminal, an international criminal, which is theoretically still on the books today, but obviously ignored. So that's what Wilson wants. The British Prime Minister at the time, George, is acceptable to what Wilson wants. He's very much in line with what Wilson wants. He wants to negotiate a better position for Britain. The guy who really resists of the so-called Big Three negotiators is the leader from France, Clemenceau. He is outraged that the Americans are coming in and dictating terms. As Clemenceau says, these Americans lost, quote, not a shack in this war, whereas much of northeastern France was absolutely annihilated. So the French are very angry, and specifically with Clemenceau, that Wilson is coming in and dictating terms. But Wilson will get his way. The British and French don't really want to support the League of Nations. They don't think it's going to be a useful tool in the future. It might just get ignored. So it appears that the British and French want to create a hardcore military alliance with the United States to ensure that if another war breaks out against Germany, that the U.S. will come in and fight with them quickly. And that would convince the Germans not to fight anymore. Wilson is a Democratic Party person. He is a Democratic president. And it appears that his great mistake in these negotiations is that he didn't bring many Republicans with him. Republicans have a lot of members in the Senate which will ratify treaties under the Constitution. So when he really shuts out the Republican Party from these negotiations, when he eventually gets this treaty and brings it back to the United States, it is not ratified in the U.S. The U.S. never accepts this treaty. So the U.S. position internationally in Europe is kind of strangled at birth for the 1920s. Their military position is annihilated, and the Americans start demanding that the troops be brought back home and never sent to Europe again. So that's one of Wilson's kind of political failures going into his last years in office. And his worry over the ratification of the treaty appears to have given him a stroke. So his last couple of years in office, he's very much incapacitated. There is a system of treaties that ends the war because there's so many different countries fighting. The biggest treaty in the system is called the Versailles Treaty, signed in a French city called Versailles. This is the treaty that ends the war against Germany. And because the Germans were being threatened with invasion, and an invasion they probably couldn't stop, they are forced to accept a lot of things that they probably otherwise would not have accepted. Number one, the Germans are forced to accept official guilt for starting the war, which is pretty questionable. And because they're guilty, they have to make payments specifically to Britain and France for all the damage they had done in the war. And these become known as the reparations payments. These are set at astronomical levels. So a payment schedule is set up for Germany to pay over about the next 50 years or so. So they didn't even plan on finishing to pay this stuff until about 1960, which is far, far into the future when you're thinking about 1919, 1920. So the Germans will be very angry at that going into the future. The German army is officially capped in the treaty at 100,000, which is a just tiny army for the time at the end of the war. They had millions of soldiers in their army by that point. So 100,000 is almost nothing. The Navy is reduced even further. That was a British demand. The Air Force is completely eradicated. Germany is, by this treaty, not allowed to have an Air Force at all. The third one, Alsace-Lorraine, that's a piece of territory that's been going back and forth between Germany and France for decades, so don't worry about that. We haven't talked about that much. A chunk of Germany is cut off from Western Germany and taken away from the German government and created as a buffer zone between France and Germany. Becomes known as the Rhineland. And the French want this because they want a big open space. So if the Germans attack France again, they have to cross that open space first, which gives the French advance notice. So it's like a tripwire. It lets you know that the attack is occurring. And if the Germans resist any of these types of terms in the treaty, officially the US, Britain, and France will attack Germany, invade the country, and probably do much damage. So this is completely a one-sided treaty that is humiliating to the Germans, but they have a gun to their head and they largely have no choice. So they vote to accept it. The German king is knocked out. No more monarchy for Germany. They get a presidency and a kind of Congress called the Reichstag. So they become a democratic republic also. Voting rights, equality under the law, all that kinds of stuff. So questions about any of these? No. All right, moving on. You can see that the Rhineland isn't really in this map so much. Poland is rebuilt. Poland had been taken away, had ceased to exist in the 1700s basically, in 1800s. It was really carved up between Germany and Russia. So a lot of the land that Russia gave to Germany in their treaty in 1917, 1918, is now given over to Poland. You have these three independent countries that are built up in the green area. So Poland goes back into existence. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is wiped out. And you get large nation states that are built up. Austria and Hungary become different governments. You get Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, all these kinds of different supposedly nationalist governments. The Ottoman Empire is also eviscerated. So you get independent Turkey is built. Greece grows back into a lot of areas that have been occupied by Greeks in ancient times. And the Ottoman Empire that extended down into the Middle East and all the way into ancient Persian lands is now also cut up and given supposedly independent governments that the British and French will, quote, protect. Why do the British and French want to protect these areas? Because of oil. These industrial economies are now running with oil and gasoline. That is what fuels the planes and the tanks and the automobiles. And a lot of machines. So access to oil is a major foreign policy goal, especially of Britain and France, and they largely control these governments for a few decades until World War II breaks out. So when you have people like bin Laden by the 1990s arguing that the Europeans have been controlling our areas in the Middle East for, by his point in the 1990s, he says 70 years. He has a very powerful argument because it's true. And when the British and French are knocked out of these areas after World War II, the Americans go in. And U.S. foreign policy becomes to control these areas as much as possible. And that's a foreign policy that obviously continues today in a lot of ways. And where has the United States been attacking and talking about attacking for the past 10, 15 years? Iraq, Syria, Iran is in here where kind of this Persian label is. Talk about protecting what eventually becomes Israel and friendly governments in the area: Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, until a little while ago. So this has a long-term effect on especially U.S. foreign policy right up to our own time. Here's a picture of the final signing of the treaties. Obviously, this is the biggest story in the world. It's the most destructive war in human history to that point. So a lot of newspaper reporters are there. It's front page news all over the world that the war is ending. A lot of European observers and foreign policy thinkers and strategists from the very beginning know that this treaty is going to fail because it's so one-sided. It's so anti-German. And we have stories of some of these reporters. Literally, a couple of reporters went walking down the steps out of this hallway. And one of them, like, this is the biggest story of his life, so he's retiring after this. And his friend asked him, so if you're going to retire, what are you going to do? What are you going to do for the rest of your life? And the first reporter says, I'm going to go find a beach somewhere. I'm going to get a house. And I'm going to basically drink martinis and watch the world go to hell. There is an immediate prediction that this treaty is going to be destructive, because the Germans will not accept it over the long term. And major German politicians will rise in direct opposition to this because the German people feel it and they remember this for a long time.